Hello, my name is Kirk McKenzie. I'm concerned about the direction that our country and our world are going in. And after more than 20 years and recent events, I am more concerned than ever. Accordingly, I have decided to be silent no more, and through a sequence of YouTube videos to share the information I have learned. I hope you find these to be informative and helpful. Thank you.
Today's topic is How to Take Our Country Back, Part 2, Tactics. This is a continuation of a dialogue that began with the series, Why We Are in So Much Debt, a three-part seminar that discusses the concepts behind the monetary system, the history of how it was established, and solutions. This was followed by How to Take Our Country Back, Part 1, which discusses an overall strategy for how to accomplish that goal. Today we're going to talk about the tactics. As in any problem-solving process, the first thing to do is to recognize a problem exists. And to that end, kudos go to Ron Paul and Glenn Beck for opening up the minds of the American people to a realization that the world does not work necessarily the way that we think. Minds have been opened. The second step then is to correctly diagnose the problem. In order to do this, we need to keep our minds open. Our beliefs are part of the problem. These beliefs are the product of decades of psychological operations. We have been embedded with certain ideas. There's misinformation. So as you approach this topic, I ask that you be a juror, not a judge. Just simply listen with an intent to understand what's being said. When you talk to other people, ask questions to clarify. There's lots of time to make judgments later. The second part of this is you have to be prepared to reevaluate everything. Glenn Beck talks about our Overton windows, and he talks about it with respect to our political views. There being a spectrum between capitalism at one end and socialism at another. And at any given time, there's a window, which is the norm that's established at the time, and represents what society is prepared to understand or accept. Through a process, this window has been moved, and what has been acceptable has been changed. To the point that all of a sudden socialism, they would have us believe, is the accepted concept, and capitalism is the radical one. This is accomplished through the Hegelian dialect and programming, indoctrination, and psychological operations, things that we'll talk about later. The same thing can be said about our understanding of the monetary system. There are certain things we believe to be true, and when we dig in, we discover that that's absolutely false, that what we believed was really not correct, and the truth is radically different than what we may believe. The challenge then is how to get most of the American people to awaken to the fact that what they believe to be true is not. It's a process comparable to deprogramming. And there are a lot of barriers to getting an individual from one place to the other. And I've personally been through these, so I understand them very well. The normalcy bias, where we tend to ignore or discount anything that's radically different. Once we open our minds, it's difficult to challenge those existing beliefs, difficult to accept the implications and the emotions that come about from those things, the fear, and of course everyone would prefer to avoid the negative. Therefore, to get people to go from one place to the correct place requires an on-ramp, baby steps. People have to be able to walk through the process and see it for themselves. Similar things can be discussed about 9/11, or even the basis and the reason for the Mideast wars. Here's an example. In 1994, the United States Congress passed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. In 1995, there was a bailout of Mexico where the American people repaid the bankers for loans that were paid to Mexico and never repaid. We see the courts ruling that it's unconstitutional if we don't give free education and health care to immigrants, even if they're illegal. an effort to have bilingual education in the schools and bilingual ballots, and the 2008 housing collapse. Now, our perspective is normally that we're all Americans. You know, we may have differences here and there, but that we share a certain common value. We have a certain coordinate system. And we look at those different things and we're unhappy about all those things, but we don't understand it, why these things are occurring, but things are looking irrational. If we change our perspective, then we begin to see that things are actually rational. There is a reason for these things. All of these things are tied to an overall plan to end the sovereignty of the United States and merge it with the Americas into an American Union, just like the European Union. The 2008 housing collapse, for example, if one studies where the housing boom occurred and where the bust ensued, and the terms of the loans, which didn't even require people to have documentation or proof of jobs or anything, one comes to the quick realization these were largely immigration loans designed to bring people into the United States, particularly from Mexico. Once we change our reference, we then have to change our overall perspective and understanding that although people here reside in the United States, that does not mean we're all Americans. The enemy face is within. Consequently, we must go through a process from our beliefs, which lead us to confusion and frustration, to open our minds to discover new truths. Second, we have to be prepared to reevaluate everyone. For example, we're led to believe that there's certain good guys, the Rockefellers, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the great reformer, Abraham Lincoln. And we have a bunch of bad guys. Charles Lindbergh, Andrew Jackson, Joseph McCarthy, John Birch, Richard Nixon, to name a few. The more you learn about the world, the more one comes to realize a shifting attitudes. Now, I'm not suggesting all these people on this side are now good guys, but they aren't necessarily the devils that they were portrayed to be. It turns out that the accusers are labeling people and who was being accused and labeled. We begin to realize that perhaps it's the accusers that need to be evaluated and not the accused. We need to understand that history is written by the winners, but only for a time. An example, in 1950, the term McCarthyism was invented. In fact, Joseph McCarthy was an ex-Marine. He volunteered for service in World War II. He was not the chairman of the House Un-American Committee. And as a fact, alleged communists did in fact permeate the executive during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's period in office and remained there. And he was very effective in bringing that truth out. So, what we in fact have is that in that period of time in which I lived, the word communism had taken great weight. It was the enemy to everything that the United States stood for. For those who are, in fact, believing in that concept, this was a great threat to them because all of a sudden here was this label, communism, and all you had to throw that out there and boom, it gained weight. In order to change people's attitudes, they had to not only defeat the word communism, but they had to come up with a substitute. So they made McCarthyism the new enemy.
A part of that plan, of course, is to induce the gradual surrender of American sovereignty, piece by piece and step by step, to various international organizations, of which the United Nations is the outstanding but far from the only example. Now, here are the aims for the United States. 1, greatly expanded government spending for every conceivable means of getting rid of ever larger sums of American money as wastefully as possible. 2, higher and then much higher taxes. 3, an increasingly unbalanced budget despite the higher taxes. 4, wild inflation of our currency. 5, government controls of prices, wages, and materials, supposedly to combat inflation. 6, greatly increased socialistic controls over every operation of our economy and every activity of our daily lives. This is to be accompanied naturally and automatically by a correspondingly huge increase in the size of our bureaucracy and in both the cost and reach of our domestic government. 7, far more centralization of power in Washington and the practical elimination of our state lines. There is a many-faceted drive at work to have our state lines eventually mean no more within the nation than our county lines do now within the states. 8, the steady advance of federal aid to and control over our educational system, leading to complete federalization of our public education. 9, a constant hammering into the American consciousness of the horror of modern warfare, the beauties and the absolute necessity of peace, peace always on communist terms, of course. And 10, the consequent willingness of the American people to allow the steps of appeasement by our government which amount to a piecemeal surrender of the rest of the free world and of the United States itself.
Interesting to look back in the history and to realize here's another organization that's been ruled to be a crazy and radical organization. But who would have thought, listening to the speech now some 50, 60 years later, that this would be Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society. Next, we must understand the root cause of the problem. An excellent book towards doing this is the book The Naked Communist by Cleon Skousen, written in 1958, again in the same period in the 50s when these struggles were going on. In his book, starting on page 259, he lays out 45 current communist goals. We can compare what he was saying they were going to do with what has happened. First, the disarmament of the United States. U.S. acceptance of coexistence is the only alternative to atomic war. A U.S. willingness to capitulate in preference to engaging in atomic war. Develop the illusion that total disarmament by the United States would be a demonstration of moral strength. Prolong the conferences to ban atomic tests because the U.S. has agreed to suspend tests as long as negotiations are in process. With respect to helping communism and finance it, permit free trade between all nations regardless of communist affiliation and regardless of whether or not items could be used for war. Extension of long-term loans to Russia and Soviet satellites. Provide American aid to all nations regardless of communist domination. And continue giving Russia access to the U.S. Patent Office. And finally, internationalize the Panama Canal. Many people do not realize that the Panama Canal was turned over to communist China, at least the control of it, under the administration of Nixon. An excellent book to read is one called From Major Jordan's Diaries. It is the diary of a major that was involved in the transportation of materials and diagrams and schematics from the United States to Russia during a policy that was enacted during the war. This operation initially started in New York City, and then it moved to an airport base in Montana, where the plane had to stop to refuel. In his diaries, he records the fact that at one time he had his soldiers stop and go in to one of the planes that the Russians were forwarding on, only to discover thousands of these so-called attaché cases carrying diplomatic documents. When they opened them up, they discovered blueprints for factories, for construction of materials, including nuclear materials, They discovered plans of our cities, maps, and in there was a mention of heavy water. And in fact, he discovers later on that something had occurred. He didn't understand at the time, but almost half of the nuclear fuel that had been generated in the United States was in fact transported to Russia under the Lend-Lease program. Next was to protect communism. First was to grant recognition of Red China, the mission of Red China to the United Nations. Now understand, under the Security Council rules, any one nation can veto the act of the United Nations. In other words, by putting Russia and China into the Security Council, one of the two, I think, of the first 5, it guaranteed the protection of communism from any world action. Set up East and West Germany as separate states in spite of Khrushchev's promise in 1955 to settle the Germany question by free elections under supervision of the United Nations. Allow all Soviet satellites individual representation in the United Nations. Resist any attempt to outlaw the Communist Party. Eliminate all laws or procedures which interfere with the operation of the communist apparatus, and to eliminate the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And finally, to discredit and eventually dismantle the FBI. In terms of world government, the plan was to promote the United Nations, the only hope for mankind. If its charter is rewritten, demand that it be set up as a one world government with its own independent armed forces. Do away with all loyalty oaths. In terms of politics, capture one or both of the political parties in the United States. In terms of our judicial system, use technical decisions of the courts to weaken basic American institutions by claiming their activities violate civil rights. It sounds an awful lot like the ACLU. Eliminate all laws or procedures which interfere with the operation of the communist apparatus. Repeal the Connolly Reservation so the U.S. cannot prevent the World Court from seizing jurisdiction over domestic problems. Give the World Court jurisdiction over nations and individuals alike. In terms of education, get control of the schools. Use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda. Soften the curriculum. Get control of teachers' associations and put the party line in textbooks. Gain control of all student newspapers. Use student riots to foment public protests against programs or organizations which are under communist attack. Emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of parents. It has always been a hallmark of communism to believe that the children belong to the state. Attribute prejudices, mental blocks, and retarding of children to suppressive influence of parents. Early education is not about education. It is about getting the children away from their parents before their parents have any impact on their children's beliefs. Age 5 was turning out to be too old. They determined that age 2, by that point, quite a bit of influence had already transmitted from the parents to the children, hence the desire for early education, preschool and the like. The overall idea, children belong to the state. In terms of communications, infiltrate the press, get control of book review assignments, editorial writing, policy-making positions. Gain control of key positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures. In terms of the culture, continue discrediting American culture by degrading all forms of artistic expression. An American communist cell was told to, quote, eliminate all good sculpture from parks and buildings, substitute shapeless, awkward, and meaningless forms. Obviously, a desire to get rid of any connection to our history and our roots. Control art critics and directors of art museums. Brings to mind the New York Times, Art Reviews, and the New York Museum of Art. Our plan is to promote ugliness, repulsive, meaningless art. Eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. Present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, healthy. Support any socialist movement to give centralized control over any part of the culture. Education, social agencies, welfare programs, mental health clinics. Discredit the family as an institution. Encourage promiscuity and easy divorce. Terms of religion. Infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with social religion. Discredit the Bible and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch. This brings to mind the National Council of Churches, an organization that was founded by a lot of people who were not Christians or believing in that message. Eliminate prayer or any phrase of religious expression in the schools on the ground that it violates the principle of separation of church and state. Terms of defamation. Discredit the American Constitution by calling it inadequate, old-fashioned, out of step with modern needs, a hindrance to cooperation between nations on a worldwide basis. Discredit the American Founding Fathers, present them as selfish aristocrats who had no concern for the common man. Belittle all forms of American culture and discourage the teaching of American history on the ground that it was only a minor part of the big picture. Give more emphasis to Russian history since the communists took over. Infiltrate and gain control of more unions. Brings to mind a Service Employee International Union. Infiltrate and gain control of big business. Transfer some of the powers of arrest from the police to social agencies. Treat all behavioral problems as psychiatric disorders which no one but psychiatrists can understand or treat. Dominate the psychiatric profession and use mental health laws as a means of gaining coercive control over those who oppose communist goals. Create the impression that violence and insurrection are legitimate aspects of the American culture, that students and special interest groups should rise up and use united force to solve economic, political, or social problems. This brings to mind the period of the 1960s. Overthrow all colonial governments before native populations are ready for self-government. In other words, to get in early into the developing nations and ensure they do not become modeled after the original founding fathers. And one that was not in the book, which will be added, came from a video in the women's movement, was to tax the whole population. Its purpose was not, as explained by Nick Rockefeller, to free women, but rather to make sure that the whole population was taxed, to remove the mothers from the kids so the kids could be turned over to the state. Therefore, the Cultural Revolution could take place. It also ensures a reduction in the population, and the numbers absolutely support this. It was a way to divide and conquer them, separate the men from the women, and to trivialize men in the process. The Communist Manifesto has a 10-point plan. It's interesting to notice that number one, and the main theme of the entire manifesto, is the abolition of private property. Historically, free man, that term means a person who owns land. In other words, land ownership means you're not subordinate to anybody else. You can live there free. Karl Marx understood that if you want to destroy a society, you have to make everybody a serf, and that can be accomplished only by taking away their land. Abolition of inheritance, to make sure that private property did not pass from one generation to the next. Outright confiscation of property. A heavy progressive income tax. It's interesting to note they talk about centralization of credit in a monopolistic central bank, like the Federal Reserve Bank or the Deutsche Bank, the Bank of England. And finally, public education combined with industrial production. Quote taken from Time magazine in 1959, "We cannot expect the Americans to jump from capitalism to communism. But we can assist their elected leaders in giving Americans small doses of socialism until they suddenly awake to find they have communism. That was Nikita Khrushchev. And we have to finally make a connection here to the international bankers. My own personal journey some 20 years ago began with concerns then about the ongoing, ceaseless increase in the national debt. And in beginning to study that issue, I started getting information and I started following the sources of the quotes to make sure they are quoted in context properly. And that led me into other areas, studies of the debt, studies of the economy, study of the Federal Reserve, study of issues related to our sovereignty, healthcare, secret societies, global warming, education, you name it. I've been there and done it. And it took several years before the final epiphanies began to occur. One comes to the realization that all of those come together in New York City, where we have world government, we have control over our monetary system, we have control over television and most other forms of mass media, including 95% of magazines. We have the birth of the socialist movement, which did not happen in Berkeley, but it happened in Greenwich Village, and so forth. It all comes down to a group of people who Abraham Lincoln referred to as the money power. They've also been called the robber barons, the international bankers, the Eastern establishment, the monetary system. And eventually it brought me back once again, now that I understood who was behind everything else, that no matter what issue you study, if you study it long enough and in depth enough, you eventually come back to the same people and the same problem. They have control over monetary system and the ability to create money from thin air. So no matter whether your education, your hot button is education or global warming or Federal Reserve or cap and trade or Agenda 21, you have two issues. Everybody has two issues. The issue that's their hot button and the issue of understanding the monetary system. One of the things that came out of that after years and years of study was a relatively simple summary. There are certain things that create debt, inflation, deficit spending, whether it's for war or socialism, punitive taxation, economic turmoil, and usury, the historical term for interest. The debt that is born by the government, corporation, or personal debt. Regardless, all of these debts are eventually paid for by the people. The matrix, the term I gave to the banking system, which is a purely computerized system with ones and zeros floating around tracking who owes what to whom, is simply that. It's kind of vapor, and it creates money by underwriting debts and issues what I call vapors, so the electronic ones and zeros, and papers, which are the Federal Reserve notes. That matrix was created by and remains controlled by international banking elite. And we, in this whole vision, bear the debt. Through the devaluation of our currency, we see prices go up, known as inflation. This is nothing more than the destruction and redistribution of your income, your savings, your investments, and a process by which children now are born into perpetual and increasing bondage. By the payment of this system and the getting our monetary system from there, or getting our money from them, it turns out that our labor and our power and our wealth all go to empowering and enriching the international banking elite, who in turn promote the debt drivers. What to us is horrible, the debt, the wars, are exactly how the international banking elite make their money. And they use that money and power to promote a world government. Now, one thing that becomes apparent to me as I talk to a number of the grassroots organizations is there's still remaining some very, very deep down beliefs that themselves need to be reassessed. And these are the most difficult of all. I call them the blind spots. One of those is this concept of collective and inherited guilt, and its obverse or reverse is the collective and inherited privileges. This directly flies in the face of individual value, individual judgment. Nobody is better than anybody else. We are all equal, at least in God's eyes. But nonetheless, we get trapped into this thinking and we allow them to get away with it because a few white plantation owners own slaves. White people are all racists and terrible people. That's the kind of thinking that occurs here. Second, the defense. Most of the people who are active believe in the defense of our nation, our country, and fighting off all these people around the world. But people have to take a look. The United States has been in perpetual war almost from the day of the Civil War. Did Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, South America, all these nations that we've either sent troops or CIA into, were they really threats to the United States? And the word defense, the Defense Department is part of the problem, just the word use of that word. Originally, when our nation was formed, it was called the War Department. When it had that name, it was primarily defensive. People must consider that now it's called the Defense Department has become an offense. This name was changed in 1947 under Truman. Next, we have inconsistencies. We want one thing from ourselves, and yet we demand something else of other people around the world. We cannot expect to retain our rights if we don't support those rights everywhere else. For example, Americans strongly believe in the self-determination of our nation. If we truly believe in self-determination, then how can we accept foreign intervention? If we truly believe in Second Amendment rights, and that it's critical to a free people to be able to defend themselves not only against robbers but against hostile governments, then how is it that we can possibly support door-to-door disarmament of every Muslim nation? And due process. We believe that we should be judged based on the facts by our peers, and that should be done in a court of law. How then can we accept the idea of drones, which go in and essentially assassinate individuals, and if it blows up their families and neighbors, well, that's just collateral damage. Foreign people are not dumb. They understand that there is a sharp difference between what we preach and what we're doing as a nation. They are not going to support our rights if we don't support theirs. It is self-defeating to be inconsistent. And finally, in the area of religion, we have to reassess how that has been altered over time. Next, we have to have a vision. Where is it we want to go? And I've given quite a bit of thought to this, and I have a number of items here that kind of express, I think, things I hear from a lot of people, like national sovereignty, a constitutional government. We're pro-choice. We want personal accountability. We want right to life, right to self-defense, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and so forth, equality before the law. It can probably best be summed up, at least some of the key parameters, is life, liberty, and private property. But this vision comes from a set of values. For example, although we call ourselves a nation of laws, in fact, we are principally a nation of principles. Principles precede the laws. The laws must conform to the principles. Those principles guide or should be guiding everything. For example, the value of human life. Now, I don't wish to preach to anybody who's not a religious person, but I do want to have everyone understand the source and the primary source of these values. Jesus Christ, whether you consider him to be a God, son of a God, or a man, lived some 2,000 years ago, and at the age of 30, he put down his carpentry and he decided that something was wrong in the world, and there needed to be a new understanding, a New Testament. And without any money, without any troops, without any violence, without doing anybody any harm, he spent the next 3 years going out amongst the people and giving his message. And we can kind of sum up some of the basic concepts that are built in this viewpoint. First, there is a God. Man is made in God's image. There is right and wrong, and basically what differentiates those two is how we treat our fellow man. There is a judgment day, and that judgment is individual. We're not judged upon who our father or our mother was. We're not judged by our race. We're not judged by our country we're born in. We're not judged by anything other than by what we do personally. We are all equal in God's eyes. It is, and Jesus Christ was, the primary source of the concept that all men are created equal. A revolutionary concept that's changed the course of civilization for the next 2,000 years. A basic underlying principle is free will. So I would suggest that our values and our vision, one of the primary underlying pinnings is the concept of individualism. And what we're having now is a struggle between a directly opposite vision called communism, which on every point is challenging. There is no God, might makes right, there is no right and wrong, whatever the outcome justifies the means, there is no judgment, we are not equal, some people are, entitled to become all-powerful. We, as a movement, must begin not to just say the things that we don't like, but we must be forward-looking, and we must be able to recapture the vision that was defined by the Founding Fathers, and be able to express that vision in positive terms. We cannot continue to be anti-this and anti-that. We must be pro-this, pro-that. Express that in positive terms. Second, we must sell this vision. It's not enough anymore to just say it is unconstitutional. That falls on a lot of deaf ears, or that it violates the law. A lot of people don't care. They bought into the idea of social justice, or that it's unfair. Well, it doesn't matter if it's unfair if it benefits me. And we have to market this vision. We have to figure out who still is responsive to these messages, target our market our segments, target our messages, and we need to target it to the hot buttons of the segments that they already have. We don't walk in with our particular hot buttons, but we must be willing to engage the hot buttons of those to whom we wish to work. We tend to be very left-brain, analytical, expanded on, kind of left-brain types of things. The other side has been very effective in just personalizing it with photos of women holding children and so forth. We also need to use more right brain, stories, personal experiences, impact on the individual. We have to reject the terms that they have defined, the terminology, and use our own terminology. And we have to unify our messages and our toolkits. Toolkits being a collection of absolutely the best materials, books, websites, white papers, etc., that help us to define a particular issue. Next, we have to have a bunch of goals, an expression of our vision as it relates to government, a constitutional government. Another one is localization of government, localization of credit and banking, of education, commerce, self-sufficiency, taxation, enforcement, a stable national currency, restoration of private property, and so forth. We have to have tangible goals that we wish to express in through our government that help us to enact the vision that we have. Ultimately, they can probably be collapsed to these three. Constitution, in other words, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The people are their sovereigns, and they designate and define the powers of government, not the other way around. Or representation in that government, and openness and accountability, of course. And primary thing is stop the big government trend. We need to localize this. Then we need to have a strategy. Well, okay, those are our goals. How do we achieve them? And how to take our country back, part one, I laid out a whole view of things and essentially defined some suggestions. Some things are on the defense because they're way ahead of us and we're playing catch up. Second Amendment, we're always under attack, our sovereignty, our health care and Obamacare, cap and trade, Agenda 21, I believe are principal among the things that we must absolutely defend against. There are other things that were come and gone, and they are the foundation of power, what I call the Tower of Power, has been built by the progressives for the past 200 years. They built them in a sequence for a reason, because each floor provides a foundation for the next, and the most fundamental foundation of the entire tower is the monetary system. We have to bring these back onto the table as issues and go on the offense. End the Federal Reserve, challenge the 16th Amendment, restore the states to the Senate, end New York's control over mass media, shut down the Department of Education, and defund the United Nations. The complete roadmap was illustrated in this diagram. Here's the Tower of Power. These are issues that we are defending against. And these are issues that have come and gone, but are really foundational and we have to return to begin the restoration. At the same time, we need to begin to build our own power structure. That begins with truth. The experts who can bring that truth have the responsibility and the opportunity to prepare the toolkits, the information needed for others, such as the books, such as these videos. Next, others have to help to get that message out through every means of communication possible. For example, I invite everyone who watches this YouTube video to help to bring other people to watch it. We need to form alliances between the various grassroots organizations in a process without taking away from the individual and the sovereignty. I call this the 3 C's, or the C3 project: communicate, coordinate, and cooperate, all in an effort to affect public opinion so that we might elect refounders and we also take direct action in areas that we can do. The toolkit consists of the best available YouTube videos and websites, white papers, handouts, presenters, presentations, etc. on a particular issue. These toolkits can be made available nationwide. It really doesn't matter who makes them. If it's good, it should be passed around to everybody. In looking at the strategy, I've come to realize that there's multiple levels here. At the federal level, I would suggest it's the 2012 elections to be focused on. At the state level, we have an opportunity to take a little bit more direct action. The two things I think we can principally do is we can go after monetary changes at the state level. Utah, for example, is now saying any sale of tax or sale of gold is by definition not a taxable event, at least from the state of Utah. More states are looking at that. And I believe this is a place where we can begin to move forward on constitutional issues. There's nothing saying that a draft constitutional amendment can't be made and passed to the states for ratification without a CONCON, a constitutional convention, or without even the federal government getting involved. We need to remind ourselves the Constitution is not a contract between us and the federal government. It is a designation of powers from the people as to what they will allow it to do. We have every right to change that designation at any time. And finally, at the local level, this is the battleground for Agenda 21 and private property. So the question is tactics, which we're going through today. In order to frame our tactics, it's useful to understand the opposition. The globalists have a well-honed playbook, and the more you study history, the more you come to the realization that they use these things over and over and over again. They learn and benefit from every conflict. We need to study the opposition and develop our own playbook and adopt into our playbook what's useful and consistent with our values. First to understand is they are all in. It is a race. It is not about what we think. It's not about them making mistakes. It's not about the fact that they don't understand what they're doing. We have to get away from that notion that all rationalizes, well, you know, they're still pretty good people, but they're making mistakes. No. Furthermore, we have to understand that in this viewpoint, the end justifies the means. Lying is perfectly acceptable. In fact, bold-faced lying right in your face, challenging you as the liar, when in fact all you're doing out is bringing out facts. What is often called chutzpah. Violations of the law and the Constitution do not matter. Those are now liquid, flexible. Even war is perfectly acceptable, and even assassinations and genocide. In the 20th century, there were at least more than 200 million people that were murdered, either a result of the communist purges in Russia, some 50 million, another 50 to 70 million in China, in all of these wars and the displacement of people across the world. All of this is perfectly acceptable, and if you don't think that's happening in the United States, people in the Weathermen organization, we're talking relatively routinely about the elimination of 25 million Americans. So don't think it can't happen here. Second, it's all about power. It's not about what's right or lawful or constitutional or what the people think. It's all about power. So we need to learn. We quite often will take the approach of trying to contact our representatives or doing petitions or convince them or show them the information they need. No. We're really not going to do much until we can show that we can remove politicians from office. Then we have some power. So we need to be able to have a direct impact on elections, legislation, and we can also affect issues not simply through representation, but through direct action. We either need to engage or concede. Third, they've had a very effective strategy of dividing and conquering. We have been a nation of different people, e pluribus unum. But in fact, what they've been successful to do, the media, the movies, and the songs and so forth, is divide us, young versus old, minority versus majority, citizen versus immigrant, male versus female, and so on. And they've done this by finding things where there's differences between these groups and then exploiting them and exaggerating them and talking them about night after night after night on the evening news without end, and teaching this in the schools, to the point all these, quote, special interests have been framed and formed. They have found and created those differences, polarized them, magnified them, agitate them, and legitimize them. In effect, what they justify is the idea of unequal treatment, so that everybody is now fighting over the communal bone. We have, in fact, I think the phrase that best defines what's been happening in the United States is e unum pluribus, from one, many. The principal technique for doing this divide and conquering is victimhood. The idea is to divide everybody into a group of oppressors and victims. The oppressors are quite often white, male, either some kind of arm of enforcement like the military, the police, the communists, and then New York City took on the Boy Scouts, even the YMCA, which people forget was a Young Men's Christian Association. And there was a YWCA for the women. Capitalism is the oppressor, religion is the oppressor, so forth, and the victims are the minorities, the females, the alternative lifestyles, labor, and the elderly. A perfect example of this is a tremendous movie called Avatar, a wonderful movie, until you begin to understand what's really being happened here. It is the portrayal of the Earth is God message, that somehow we can all live in the trees happily and coexist with the wolves and talk to the trees, and that the horrible, mean, terrible people that are doing this are generally in that movie shown to be white, male, military capitalists. That is a movie that will affect the minds of a generation of children. Next is the control over the terminology. If they want the people to be viewed as oppressors, then they use words like insurgents versus freedom fighters. Regimes. The word, when they call a government a regime, you know that's one that's next to be bombed, versus governments. The Branch Davidian compound, instead of calling it a ranch or a retreat. Or the Ruby Ridge Mountain Fortress, instead of what it really was a small logging cabin clinging to the face of a cliff. Their view is it's okay to invent the oppressors even if they don't exist, and it's not true, because truth does not matter. And if you notice that the definition and division of oppressors versus victims again falls along the idea of this collective and inherited guilt. Everybody is responsible, everybody of this race is responsible for the acts of a few, or everybody here is responsible for the acts of a few. And what they've done is managed to create hatred and polarization. And they've also given these, quote, newly defined victims a belief in the firmness of their right to steal money from other people. They feel justified. People who come from Mexico, for example, Hispanics, when given the ideology that somehow we destroyed Mexico, they now feel like it's their just right to take it back. It's completely refuted by the history, but that doesn't matter. Solidarity. This is an interesting one. You have under the one political party, the Democratic Party, a lot of disparate interests that have been unified under that banner. All of them fall in the category of victims. And these people would normally not like each other. They'd have arguments. For example, the African Americans who were born in this country and have fought in our wars, all of a sudden are dealing with the immigrants and taking their jobs. And yet they both vote for the same party, a party that supports immigration. And you have Hispanics who are largely religious people voting for the Democratic Party, which supports values that are completely different from their Christian beliefs. What their message is you get what you want by supporting others. And what they then focus on are the hot buttons of each of these classes of victims. And when they talk to that class of victims, they keep their message to that hot button only. Here is the diagram. The Democratic Party consists of a group of individuals, the minorities, the elderly, the unions, the Hispanics, the gays, all of whom will vote for that party, regardless of what it does to them otherwise, because they get one thing that's the most important issue to them. It's interesting to note that the Democratic Party has now thrown the elderly under the bus. They no longer need that group because they have enough immigrants to vote the way they want them to vote and union members. One of the approaches they take to getting all these changes is the Hegelian dialectic, where today you have the norm. And what they do is they make an extreme demand well outside of where society is at the moment, but it creates dissonance. And people feel, well, that is terrible. And then what they end up doing is accepting something lesser than that. But opinion has been shifted, and over time, that becomes the new norm. And this process is now repeated. And over time, the norm continues to shift. Demands are made, compromises are made, and everything begins to shift. This process of compromising and shifting of the attitudes is exactly what's discussed about in this concept of the Overton window that we've talked about before. That's also happening to our culture. It's happening to our understanding of inflation. For example, in the 50s or 60s, there was a huge uprising of housewives complaining about the cost of food. They were complaining that it was now costing more than $10 to buy a shopping cart full of food. Today, we accept the idea of inflation. The value of life is being compromised. Our expectations of the future are being compromised. And the truth is being compromised. In order to recapture the truth now, we have to have open minds. The Delphi technique is a method for reaching consensus, a way of running meetings, and it has its valid uses in business and so forth. But it can also be misused in a way that generates the appearance of support for a preordained outcome, and that is what's happening with the execution of Agenda 21. They control the questions, the answers, the group. They control the seating. If anybody speaks up, they tend to cut them out from the herd so that nobody else will do the same, isolate and discredit the opposing views. We also need to understand Saul Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals, in which he lays out 13 propositions. First, that I'm going to focus on, is put the enemy in an indefensible position. And the way that you do that is you hold the enemy up to their rules, their ideas, their values. For example, Americans do believe in equality. And by that we mean the equality in God's eyes, or the equality of our self-worth, depending on whether you're religious or not. But they've shifted the meaning of the word equality to mean equal wealth, equal outcomes. You have a hard time when they say, aren't you for equality? Well, of course I am, but not for what you're talking about. Very effective. Ridicule. Make a joke out of the other person. The threat is more terrifying than reality. Pushing hard enough will produce a response which can be used. They're goading you. They enjoy this. They want you to react. And then they take your reaction and make it look like you're the bad guy. And they isolate it, freeze it, personalize it, polarize it. And by that they mean they come after the individual. They don't just say, hey, we're against this organization, but they identify specific individuals, leaders of those organizations, and they go on the attack. Truth does not matter, only outcomes. For example, it is an absolute irrefutable at this point that this whole thing about global warming is a hoax. This whole concept was born in the 1960s as a way to justify a global government. They needed to have a global problem. But in fact, the statistics simply do not support the argument. The AIDS epidemic was getting nowhere in terms of AIDS until they started to say, well, that was now crossed over into the heterosexual groups. That turned out to be an absolute lie. But now that, quote, the majority were concerned about getting it, then all of a sudden there was support for more aid for AIDS. False flag operations is a military thing. You will create an event secretly and then have your opponent blamed for their response. Essentially, you goad the opponent into a position where they do something such as blow up Pearl Harbor, and then that justifies what you originally wanted, which is entry into World War II. They control the language. They use very, very loaded words. Just like the word communist we discussed about before, they'll use the word terrorist. They will refer to people as terrorists, not patriots. Regimes, not governments. Compounds, not ranches. Mountain fortress, not a cabin. Certain words are repeated so often, so frequently, with such vehemence, they become almost nuclear, and they're all labeling words. They're designed, once they build these things, they just have to pin them on an individual, and that individual is completely neutralized. Racist, birther, terrorist. And they also give alternative meanings to words that we use otherwise. So they're actually able to engage in a dialogue on national television and in the news, and we interpret it to mean one thing when in fact what's really being discussed is something else. Open space, for example, sounds like something everybody would support, until you realize it means the destruction of farms and the return of the majority of the world back to a wild state, and the elimination of single-family homes. Homeland security, we would automatically interpret that to mean that they're keeping us secure. Little did we know that they're keeping the nation secure from us, from the patriots who like a constitutional government. Stability, is a word that's used frequently. Stability is not democracy, is not freedom. It is simply control. That means door-to-door disarmament and totalitarian governments. Those are stable. Equality, as we've discussed. Racism. Racism in their language doesn't mean that you're a racist. It just means you're a member of the majority and you're speaking out. Progress, as we've learned, is really not progress in the way that we think. It is progress towards communism. And so on. Freedom of religion has been turned on its head to mean that that means no religion. Democracy is given a new meaning. Leave no child behind. Sounds like a wonderful theme until you realize it also means let no child get ahead. Diversion and redirection. For example, finally, after years, the question of Obama's legitimate birth certificate became a national issue. Right in the middle of that hitting its peak, we have the news jump on bin Laden's death, an event that's highly questioned by people that allegedly came in and got bin Laden years later, finally found this guy after all this time, managed to kill him and burying him at sea with nobody having, nobody able to see this. All very suspect. Did in fact bin Laden, was he killed or did he die years and years ago? Was this just a diversion to get the focus off of Obama? And another example is they will take, somebody comes out and says, hey, you're cheating, and they'll come back at you and say, well, you're a cheater, and they just immediately flip it back on you. Diversion is pretty easy to spot once you start to look for it. Look for events that occur in the same time frame, simultaneous events. They normally would seem disconnected, but if you take a closer look, you begin to see that A leads to response B, and that A and B are connected. Evaluate the people behind these things, who lost, who gained, and why. False flag operations, we've discussed. Their purpose is to achieve an objective and appear justified in doing so, and they have any number of methods to accomplish this. And there are plenty of examples that there is now considerable historical evidence to suggest that a lot of the wars that we've entered into as a country were in fact false operations that got them into the wars. So now we're ready to talk about tactics. First is organization. Each one of the grassroots organizations need to consider its mission. What is it all about? To date, it's been pretty much about waving flags and holding monthly meetings. I think another way to look at each of these groups' missions is that what we are is we're organizers. We are now organizers of a new patriotic movement, a restoration movement to restore our country. And it really doesn't matter whether you're Tea Party, 9/12, a Second Amendment, Campaign for Liberty, a constitutionalist group, or just plain property owners or union or white collar. really we all should be participating in this movement. And I think the grassroots organizations can fulfill the role of being the educators. They can bring the truth to the public and to their communities. I think over time they'll be seen as the source of the truth. If they do this the right way, they need to be the leaders in making sure that the votes really do count and there's voter integrity and turnout, and they can be the leaders for direct action. In terms of meetings, based upon all the meetings I've gone to, the typical approach in most organizations is to have a monthly meeting. The focus is to bring in a speaker for educational purposes on some new topic and to get more attendance to each of the monthly presentations. Generally, there are too few attendees, and of those who attend, there's too few who commit time to do anything. And these groups came together, many of them, the Tea Party groups and so forth, came together with lots of energy and sign waving and petitions, but really little understanding of what needs to occur. An alternative approach is actually to think about us, as I said, as organizers of single restoration movement and focus not so much on education. The education is important, but once you understand it, don't keep doing it over and over again. You got to take action. The way to do that is focus on your core team, the people who show up at the meeting on a regular basis, the people who are willing to do things, the people who are unquestioned in their loyalty to the restoration. Have them meet weekly. Monthly is not enough, and establish a private email or communication channel just for these members so they can have real-time communications throughout the week. The monthly meetings then become more for the public, and those can follow a course outline. I would suggest that the issues of the day that I've laid out in How to Take Our Country Back Part 1 are the perfect outline and course to follow. Educate people on those 10 or 11 issues. And because there's too few people, we have to figure out how to multiply the impact of every single core team member by 1,000-fold if possible. The weekly meetings then become the meetings of the core. These are private meetings where you talk about your plans and your tactics and you review your progress. You hold your boot camp training. You handle the administrative matters. Too many groups try to handle all these things in their monthly public meetings, and people come, they see this disorganization, they see this lack of, strategy, they never come back. Don't put this in the monthly meeting. Handle this offline. And after disputes, this is where you handle them. The monthly meetings then are for the public, they're professional, and they're open, and they can focus on education or training and recruitment of people into the core, but they should be viewed as a separate kind of a meeting. Next is a concept of teamwork. Teams of two. Many people don't like doing things by themselves, and this is particularly true of precinct walking. If somebody hasn't done it before, doesn't understand it, they will not generally go out and do it. They much prefer to go with somebody else, and hopefully somebody that has done this before can show them how it works. So I think that groups would be well to start adopting this approach of teams and proactively begin to pair its experienced members with those that are inexperienced. Even better yet is full teams, more than teams of two. And this is a perfect way to defeat the Delphi technique. Here's how that kind of works. If you have a full team and you go to, say, a public meeting, if you go as an individual and you raise certain questions, more than likely the moderator is going to try and separate you from the herd fairly quickly and kind of trivialize you. Other people in the audience might have actually agreed with you, but they're a little shy. They don't want to create controversy. They won't say anything, and they know that they're going to get targeted if they do, so that's the end of any discussion along those lines. Well, if you bring your second team member, that person can back you up. have that team member sit separately from you so that it doesn't look as if there's a team of two. It looks just like another member, and that person says, when the first person asks a question gets blown off, that person says, well, wait a minute, I thought that was a good question. I'd like an answer. It doesn't have to be much more dramatic than that, but you can back each other up. If you have a third person, so much the better, and in fact, an entire team. And if you have a team, you set them in the diamond pattern, you spread them out to where they're in the front, back, and sides of the room. It is important that you arrive separately, you sit separately, you don't associate during the meeting, and you leave separately. In other words, you're giving the appearance of being separate interests, separate people, not somebody ganging up on everybody else. If you have a team B, the next meeting that they can take charge, and the others can kind of back off or not even attend. And likewise, a team C. In order to make this work, you have to prepare ahead of time. Get your team together, teach them this technique, get everybody to understand how it works and how best to make it happen, practice. And then it's important that you know your topic. If you're going to go to a meeting and ask questions, the questions have to be good ones. Probably you're going to discover out of your team a few people really know their stuff, and maybe they're better spokespeople. So let them lead the questions and the others become backups. Another question to consider in an organization is vertical versus horizontal. The vertical is the classical hierarchical organization where communications and policies and decisions flow through structured channels. The opposite of that is kind of what's happened in the Tea Party movement. You have just spontaneous organizations setting up independently across the country. They are independent, they have their own leaders, they have their own meetings, they have their own sources of money. They're free to go and do whatever they want and charge off. Kind of like the Minutemen when we won the war. It's kind of like the British versus the Minutemen. It's kind of a guerrilla warfare technique. There's pluses and minuses of both. I was the California State Chair for the Ross Perot United We Stand America organization. That organization was vertical. We had Ross Perot at the top. He built a national organization in Dallas. Then they had elected state chairs as well in each one of the organizations. I was California's. Underneath that, we had representatives from every single congressional district. So we had a CDC, we called it, a person who was the main coordinator for that congressional district. And in each congressional district, we had one to multiple chapters. We had, for example, 52 or so CDCs in California and hundreds of chapters and 40,000 members. Problem is, the WSA failed for several reasons. One was a lack of direction coming from Ross. He put it together and then didn't say where to go charge. There was no consensus at state organizing meetings, and issues were all over the map, and everyone was waiting for direction and consensus from above. Politics became an enormous problem. We had a few very objectionable characters. We had a few with hidden agendas to actually disrupt the harmony. Lots of personal attacks and whispered campaigns. In other words, it became like Washington, D.C. At the end of the day, it had all dissolved. In the meantime, in parallel, was the thing called the Defoliate campaign up in Washington. The Speaker of the House was Tom Foley, and a woman actually, and her husband that lived in the district decided they were going to take it upon themselves to remove him from office and replace him with someone else. They had no direction, no consensus, no approval, they just did it. And the result was this whole campaign gained national attention, and they succeeded. It worked. Just one woman and her husband were able to be the seeds to start an entire movement that succeeded. So the alternative to this vertical kind of structure is this, kind of an organic, distributed structure, lots of independent organizations. Now, the strengths are kind of like the Defoliate campaign. Nobody's waiting for direction and consensus. Nobody's waiting for permission. Nobody's waiting for financing. It's certainly less vulnerable to attack because it's hard to attack all of these organizations, and they're smaller, there's a lot fewer politics. But the disadvantage that I've seen in traveling around and meeting these organizations is this overall lack of focus. Different organizations doing different things, and on the national scale it becomes so much white noise. Every one of these groups has very limited resources. They have very limited technical skills on how to build a website or do a presentation or give a presentation, for example. They have varying levels of understanding of the issues. There's a tremendous amount of redundancy between what they're doing and various skill levels at what they're trying to do. So from that came the idea of C3 program, to communicate, coordinate, and cooperate. How do you retain and maintain the vitality of the independent organizations and yet counteract the deficiencies? So the answer is communication is an absolute necessity. Begin the process of starting communication across these organizations to lead towards voluntary, not mandatory, not tops down, but peer-to-peer coordination and cooperation. Not only is it a necessity, it is also your greatest opportunity. And I'm a strong believer that this communication should be organic, not hierarchical, not controlled. It should be allowed to grow however people want it to grow. So the solution to the problems with these independent organizations is communication, coordination, and cooperation. Those organizations who do well at this will increase their communication, understand it's part of their core mission is to communicate, whether it's sign waving or sending a petition or writing a letter to their editor or creating a YouTube video. These are all competing forms of communication. They need to figure out which ones work to reach the widest audience. Those that begin to understand the power of the internet are going to have much more effect in terms of their communication and reaching out to other organizations. The principal tool for this is the internet. You can get this started simply by email. Now, all of us have too many emails and too little time in the day. I, more than any other, was extremely guarded in my inbox and set up all kinds of rules and things to filter stuff out and got it all under control. I've completely changed that. I join as many other email lists from the grassroots members across the nation as possible because I want to hear what they have to say, and I've learned a tremendous amount from that. I would encourage everybody to begin to change your view on this, start dialing in, learn how to control lots of emails. It's very simple to do once you know a few methods. But this is where you need to start. And turn off the TV. Take the time away from the controlled media and start dialing into the public media. Video, YouTube is a wonderful tool to use. Collaboration tools include GoToMeeting and WebEx and Central Desktop. Social groups like Facebook, LinkedIn, Meetup.com, Twitter. And then you can also connect those with the conventional things. Get on radio shows where you can, send out press releases, letters to the editor, and so forth. Again, the question is email overload or blessing. I think it's a blessing. Having tried to organize United We Stand America in a day of fax machines and robot calls and so forth, I can tell you there's a huge difference in what we can do if we understand the blessing we have in terms of being able to communicate. Next, we can start a process of healing this country, a process of unification. We, the grassroots people, now that we're connected together and communicating, coordinating, cooperating with each other, can move forward. We need to reach out to other groups, like the elderly that were abandoned. Their hot button is retirement security, for example. We can reach out to the farmers and ranchers whose property rights are under assault. Reach out to small business. We can reach out to unions whose members are principally concerned about job security. And we reach out to them about their hot buttons. Just as the liberals have done, we can do the same thing. And we can also begin to change the dialogue, because there's not a group up here that's not a victim of what's going on in terms of these special handouts of the national funds that are being taken from people. And finally, we can use momentum to restore the Republican Party to constitutional principles, and then hopefully the party itself can then become truly a representative of the constituents. In so doing, the hope is that we can begin to bring people back. We may not eliminate all the differences, but we can certainly get rid of the hostility and the drama surrounding this. And once people begin to do that, they're going to realize that all of us are victims of this international banking globalization. We're not going to be able to do this without becoming much more comfortable with confrontation. And an excellent book I encourage everybody to read is the book called Confrontational Politics by former California Senator H.L. Richardson. And in here, it's an excellent resource, and I encourage people to read it. I'll just touch on a few points. He talks about the fact that conservatives are largely individualists, that we are inhibited by our beliefs and values, turn the other cheek, do unto others. Our beliefs lead us to be non-confrontational. We don't want to offend or make waves. We certainly don't want to be labeled. When somebody directs a question to us, we can feel compelled to answer the question, which actually gives the other person control over the conversation. And, they come after us and attack us, and we tend to be defensive. The globalists take advantage of these facts. They aren't afraid of confrontation. In fact, they're promoting confrontation. They enjoy it. They plan for it. And it has been working for them extremely well, largely because the other side doesn't know how to handle it. His point is it's conflict or capitulation. We must be confrontational, and we can be confrontational without violating our core values. In summary, the meek may not inherit the earth. We need to begin to become more vocal. The globalists tend to have a pagan atheist attitude. Western civilization is their enemy. They wrap totalitarianism in humanitarian clothing, and they pursue these globalist strategies. Now, these are just a few of the points that are being made in the book, and I'm just giving you additional points. He then does a comparison between the two worlds. One's on the offense, the other's on the defense. One's looking for harmony, the other's looking for confrontation. One is being direct, we tend to talk the truth, say it like it is. The other is looking for diversion and obfuscation. One believes in education, the other believes in indoctrination. One believes in the individual, the other the collective. Equality versus power, value versus outcomes, the value of human life versus survival of the fittest. So I think we can also embrace some of the concepts in Saul Alinsky's work. And I think in particular, go outside the experience of the enemy. They're not used to the silent majority and the other elements of society actually standing up and waving signs and appearing at meetings and being confrontational. This is something completely new. They're going to be thrown off. We're going outside their experience. Second, we have to put the enemy in an indefensible position, and we do it by holding them up to their rules. So, for example, if they're pro-choice, then shouldn't we have a choice in how we use our home and our land? Shouldn't we have a choice in where our kids go to school? Shouldn't we have a choice to do homeschooling? If they're pro-equality, then how can they be for social justice? How can they have different laws and rules for different people? If they believe in sustainability, then do they believe in the sustainability of the American culture and the sustainability of the American dream? So we can use their words against them and do so very effectively. Those who have the skill can also learn to ridicule them. A lot of cartoons have been circulating about Obama that are excellent. Keep it up. We can do this by making, I think we can have a little fun in doing what we do if we just change our mindset towards it. Keep the pressure on, and again, isolate it freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. In other words, when you're talking at a meeting and you're looking from some association that's trying to work on Agenda 21, don't just think about the association, think about the specific individuals that are taking the opposite position and freeze what they're saying in time. The best single way to do that is cameras or video or sound recordings, because once it's on tape, it's there forever and can be repeated and repeated and shown to hundreds of thousands of people. Coordination. Now, this is a legal concept pioneered by Fred Kelly Grant up in Napa, Idaho. It's a 10th Amendment concept. People should become familiar with it. This is not going to be a complete dissertation, but just something to let you know this is something you should definitely get involved in. In essence, it's a constitutional requirement. The federal government cannot just simply come in and dictate the terms. There must be coordination with the local entities. And ultimately what that means is that the local entities have to be supportive of what the federal government wants to do, or they can stop it in its tracks. This also applies to executive orders. They can't just come in and implement these without some kind of local approval. Invoking this right of coordination is being used very successfully in the Agenda 21 fights, and others definitely become familiar with it. Sheriffs are people that can invoke these rights, and in fact, in some places now it's gotten to the feds cannot even come into the area until they've come to the sheriff's office and registered, explain what they want to do, and the sheriff is responsible defending the rights, the constitutional rights of the people in the community. This directly ties into Sheriff Richard Mack's theme that the sheriffs can be the key to preserving our Constitution. Go to the website Trade America. That's Fred Kelly Grant. Get his book, get his DVD, study up, get your group involved. And one video that you can watch is actually a presentation made by Fred Kelly Grant to the Reading Tea Party Patriots up in Northern California. Go to the video called, this is on YouTube, called Fred Kelly Grant and the 10th Amendment. Advocacy is yet another principle. Governments must have jurisdiction. They can't just do anything. It has to be designated that this is their proper jurisdiction. They have to have the authority to act. This has to be written, and it's basically delegated from the top down. So the federal government dictates or transfers some of its jurisdiction to the state to the county to the city. In addition, governments have to comply, and they have to comply with a ton of things. Not only their own laws, regulations, and procedures, but all of those of every government jurisdiction above them, all the way back to the federal level. Just turns out that they're in violations almost all the time. They're violating something, and they don't really care because nobody's holding them accountable. So compliance with all this is enforceable. You can go after them for non-compliance, and that's being done effectively here in California in some cases. And you can actually, any decisions that have been made in a forum or a city council meeting or some committee that's been formed can be reversed if they have not either had the jurisdiction or acted in compliance with the laws. In California, perhaps one of the strongest of those is the Brown Act, which means that the city councils cannot make decisions that are not publicly, meetings held publicly. And if they're in violation, then those decisions can be reversed. There was a mayor in the area that was elected in violation of the Brown Act, and she was removed from office. Next, I think the grassroots have to make sure that we have voter integrity. Get involved. Here in California, we probably estimate somewhere between 8 to 15% of the votes are from dead people, illegal immigrants, and the like. The violations are abundant. I think most Americans would be shocked. Areas of concern, this whole policy of get out the vote. It's get out the vote at any cost, generally from minorities or even illegal votes, doesn't matter. Get them to vote, get them to the polls. Procedures have been adopted that are absolutely destructive. For example, the voting booths in California, they take the votes during the day and they have lists of people who have voted and they post them on the wall. People come in, they track who's voting, they telephone this information back, and they wait till the end of the day, and in the last hour or so, people who haven't voted yet and who have a history of not voting, well, somebody comes in and claims who they're, John Smith, and they are not required to show that they are John Smith. There's no proof of identity required, no driver's license, no photographic. They just say they're John Smith and they get to vote. These electronic voting machines, the principal manufacturer of those is Diebold. Diebold is the person or the company that creates the automatic teller machines for the banks. It is highly suspect that a system that creates a paper trail has been substituted or replaced by an electronic system that is not, and a system that can be completely controlled, where even small shadings of votes, intelligently done by a computer, can change the outcome of elections. Everybody should be highly suspect and try and get electronic voting out of their districts. We have a huge problem with mail-in ballots because this is, again, where a lot of fraud occurs. People don't even have to walk in. People are selling their ballots to somebody else and so forth. Old people in homes that don't know what they're doing, just to have a visit from somebody will, let them fill in their ballot for them. And on. Voter registration, who's on the rolls, and military votes. These are largely mail-in ballots, and they're not being counted in California in a number of cases. Next, simply non-compliance. Tyranny becomes absolute only when the people internalize their acceptance of the rules. You don't have to accept. It doesn't mean you have to be violent or whatever, but you don't have to support what's wrong or harmful. Ultimately, it's about the kids, and we can immediately begin to have an impact. We must begin to take back their educations and to make sure that the values and this knowledge is passed on to them so that they will not be the first generation to lose the American dream. You can take control now, get involved in school boards, get involved in homeschooling. There's no reason why the Patriots can't develop a workshop, a Patriots workshop. They've been given on Saturday mornings or Saturday afternoons, and have the parents bring the kids. That can happen right now. It doesn't require anybody's approval. The boomers are a primary source. They're retired. They have the knowledge. They have the skills. Pull them into the process. And if you're a boomer, put some time into helping. In summary, here is a comprehensive view. We have values of which free will, individualism are paramount. We have a vision based upon life, liberty, private property. We have goals, things that we want to see implemented in our government based upon a representative government, a set of rules, a way government, a limited government defined by the people, a constitution, representation in that government, and localization. We have a proposal now here where I have, I think, enunciated 11 items that I think everybody should focus on. Strategy, and then this presentation on tactics. And the final analogy, it rests on action. If you want to get our country back, please get involved and please begin to take some action. I want to thank you for your time. This video is available on DVD. You can come, that's available from the website, www.silentnomorepublications.com. You can also come and see other videos of mine at the YouTube channel, Silent No More Pubs. And you can contact me at author@silentnomorepublications.com. Thank you again for your time, and may we succeed in our endeavors.